Welcome back, everyone. I'm Julia, your host of the Mentorship podcast, a series that features diverse industry professionals. We mentor you by highlighting different fields and going through our guests' academic and career path, from high school to their current role. In our Season 5 finale, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Sarika Cullis-Suzuki, a marine biologist by trade, science communicator, and co-host of The Nature of Things. Sarika's impressive journey includes a bachelor's degree in Integrative Biology from the University of California in Berkeley, a master's in Zoology from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD in Marine Biology from the University of York in the UK. Her groundbreaking research during grad school focused on the global impact of fishing. In 2022, Sarika took on the role of co-host for The Nature of Things, following in the footsteps of her father, the legendary David Suzuki. In this episode, we explore the fascinating field of marine biology and what it means to build a career in science communication. So here to mentor us, it is Dr. Sarika Cullis-Suzuki. Welcome, Sarika, to the Mentorship podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you feeling?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you. You are such a strong representative of environmentalism. You're also our first person with a background in marine biology. So we're very happy to have you as our first in this industry. We're also introducing a new segment in today's episode where we will feature a student in the last 10 minutes or so and have her ask you a question as well. And she's pursuing marine biology, so it's such a great opportunity to be able to connect students to industry leaders like yourself.
Wonderful. Can't wait to meet them.
So to start off and have you mentor our audience about this field and talking about your career path, I'm going to get into it right from the beginning and ask you, what did you want to be when you grew up and what kind of things interested you when you were younger?
Well, I think that I was in kind of a unique situation where I always knew what I wanted to be. I remember when I was 6 years old on the beach with my mom, and I said to her, I want to be a marine biologist and you can be my assistant. And I distinctly remember that because I knew in my heart that's what I wanted to do. I mean, granted, I had no idea what a marine biologist did. To me, it was just what I was doing at that moment, which was playing in the ocean, flipping over rocks, scooping up the sea creatures. That's what I thought it meant to be a marine biologist, which, sometimes maybe, but that's not all it takes. But I just knew that I wanted to always be connected with the sea. And I was lucky because I was born and raised in Vancouver, lived in British Columbia most of my life. And every summer, my family made sure that we would spend time together, camping in provincial parks, going swimming, fishing. And it was because of these summers spent in the ocean that I developed that love of the seashore. So I don't think everybody has that. Um, and I was lucky in the sense that I knew what I wanted to do from a very young age. But actually, when I was in high school, biology, that kind of stuff was not my best subject. I mean, it was fine, but I did well in English and I loved to write. And so when it was time to decide if I wanted to go to university, and I realized that I did, I thought that I would probably go into English. But then I took a year off and I really thought about it. And I realized actually my heart was in the ocean and I wanted to go into marine biology. And that's when I, had to do all the physics and organic chemistry as that's your love, right? That's your background. And calculus,
Yeah.
you do all the science and stuff. And that wasn't something that I loved or excelled at, but I wanted to become a marine biologist and it was necessary. And it's interesting now when I meet people, and a lot of people have said to me over the years, oh, marine biology, I always wanted to become a marine biologist. And I say, well, what happened? And they said, oh, I didn't like the math, or I didn't like the I didn't like certain aspects of the science. And I feel like that's too bad because to me, fundamentally, what it is to be a scientist is just asking questions, is just being curious. And yes, you have to take these courses, but that shouldn't define you as a scientist, right? And so anyway, so that's how I came into it in university. And it was the first time that I was able to go abroad and conduct my own scientific experiments. I learned to scuba dive and I completely fell in love with
Mm,
it. And so the same month that my undergrad finished, I began a master's program in fishery science because I just couldn't get enough of it.
I have actually noticed that too with some students that they have this interest in marine biology as a certain dream or vision, but then having to get through the sciences can be difficult at times. So it's good to hear that, it's only one part of your journey. And it's usually in the early stages where you go through those courses and then are able to get into the passions later. Even going into your childhood, too, I wanted to mention how, of course, you have two very well known environmental activists as parents. And I wanted to hear, too, as how that shaped your interest in science, because in some cases, sometimes people kind of stray away from what their parents do. And it seems like it's interesting, too, on how, you had this interest in the sea and marine biology. And then did you have that influence as well from your parents on how important conservation was and environmental issues and things like that? Did that have an effect on you as a child as well?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
My parents are the biggest influences in my life, and we spend a lot of time together. My parents never shied away, especially my dad, of telling me, how he interpreted the state of the world. And you can imagine around the Cullis-Suzuki dinner table at night, the types of conversations we would have. He was very passionate, very much, we're going over a cliff, and he would always say, like, the sky is falling. And my mom was always on the other side of the table saying, okay, so what are we going to do about that? And
Mm,
I was so lucky. And I'm grateful that you brought up my mother too. It's not
of
just my dad
course.
who is this epic environmental activist, but my mother was key, has been key to his success, and certainly for our successful family life. So she always showed me, my dad was there saying, these are the problems. And my mom was on the other side saying, and this is what we can do about it. And I feel like if I
Mm,
hadn't had my mother's approach and influence, I would be a very different person. So I always grew up with the knowledge of what was going on in the environmental realm, in the scientific realm, but I always felt like there was something I could do about it. And I think that's something that
mm,
we really need to highlight, especially among young people today. We are so connected with what's going on in the world, maybe too connected. It's very easy to be disillusioned and to feel powerless and alone. And it
yeah.
is fundamental to know that all of us can contribute to fundamental
Mhm.
change. So, yeah, they influenced me a ton. And when I decided to go into marine biology, I remember when I told my mom, like, oh, I'm not going to do English, I want to do marine biology. And I thought she would be really happy for me and say, oh, that's great, good for you. But I remember she kind of looked at me. She was like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, okay. And I'm like, that was a weird reaction, but I didn't think
Yeah.
about it anymore. And fast forward to years later, and I finally understood why she had kind of hesitated in that moment.
Mm,
And it's because at first, all I was learning was the wonder of the ocean, how amazing it was, how to go scuba diving, and, everything's so incredible. But the deeper I got into it, the more I realized and more I learned that the oceans are being trashed in so many different
mm,
ways. And humans, lo and behold, are behind it all. And I got really down. By the time I was doing my master's, I was like, we're so screwed, right? And this was exactly why my mom wasn't overcome with joy that I wanted to go into biology, because she knew that was on the horizon. She knew
mm,
that eventually I would discover these things and I would have some existential issues coming up. So
yeah.
that's the wisdom of mothers, right? They want to
Yeah.
see you do what you want to do, but they also want to protect you.
Yeah, and it can be difficult. And I definitely have some questions about that too. I do want to get into your time at UC Berkeley. You're actually our third person to have graduated from there, which is really interesting.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
on the podcast, I mean. And so one was in chemistry that was recently, and another in chemical engineering. So it's cool that we're able to showcase UC Berkeley in different lights as well. So I would love to hear a little bit about your experience there. You hinted at some things that you did, and kind of giving our audience an understanding of the landscape of the biology program that you took there and the type of courses, what you were learning, the lifestyle, especially being in a Californian environment too.
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I had no connection to that school. I didn't know California. I knew that it was a good school, but that's about all I knew. And my dad really was strong about a huge part of your education is leaving your comfort zone, leaving the place that you grew up and learning about another place. And he felt
Mm,
like it was very important for us to get to know the United States in an intimate way. And I ended up moving there shortly after 9/11. I think it was a year after.
mm,
That's when I started my undergrad. And you can imagine things were charged. Although now that seems like a quaint time, but at the time it was very much a charged situation. And of course, Berkeley itself is an unbelievable academic institution. But what I learned, what I really took away from it was the social dimension. And it was
mm,
equally, if not even stronger, the idea that freedom of speech came from Berkeley, and that this college campus is the heart of the city. So you would have Hillary Clinton coming to give a talk, and then you would have Bob Dylan coming to perform, and you would have marches and protests every single day on campus. There was naked people on campus all the time doing stuff, and it was like this unbelievable place to be surround like you're learning about other people, you're learning about social dynamics, you're learning about history, and at the same time you're also going to class, right, and learning about
mm.
chemistry and physics and all this stuff. So
Yeah.
um, I am so grateful for the education that I had, and I think that people going to university who choose to go to university need to recognize that it's not just about what you're learning in the class, but it's about everything
Mm,
that's going on around you. And if you have the opportunity to choose where you go, that to me is one of the fundamental things that I hope my kids choose to do, is to go to an institution where they feel like their values can be heard, that their ideas are taken seriously, that there's a diversity of people who are speaking. We had homeless people join our classrooms and speak. Like
oh, wow.
it was different than any other university that I'd experienced before. I think that, in the last little while things have been changing, and there are more creative ways to learn, and institutions are trying to be more open-minded. We know that a lot of them are very colonial in nature, and there are a lot of barriers for people to access them.
Mhm.
But especially in 2001, 2002, it felt like a really revolutionary kind of happening center of action for me. And as a Canadian, wow, I sure learned a lot.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting too. And it's not just about the courses, like you said, it's about the environment and positioning yourself in a place where you can grow and thrive in so many different areas beyond the course material. So that's such a great perspective. It's very different than what we heard in the past about Berkeley, because I think in the past we talked more about just the courses and stuff like that. So it's great to hear about the lifestyle because that's so important too. I came from Toronto Metropolitan University for my undergrad. And I think it's so important to talk about the lifestyle there. It's so innovative and it's right downtown in the core. And that all plays a factor in how your 4 years or 5 years there are going to be. So that's such a great insight to hear. And I'm curious too about the biology program itself because you took integrative biology. Is that right? So was
Yeah, thank you
that,
for doing that research on me. I love talking about that.
I was wondering if it was more, well, actually, I even researched the curriculum because I was trying to get an understanding of what integrative biology is, because I'm coming from a background where it was either just chemistry or biology. And then I know how some schools are more specialized, like the student I'm connected to, she's in marine biology. So I was
Mhm.
wondering, how integrated biology looks. Is it more broad, and then you have the ability to specialize a bit later in things like marine biology? What was that like?
I think the first couple years are basically you have to take a set course load,
Hmm.
and it
Yeah.
has most of the science packed in there. By your third year, you can take a few electives, and then by your fourth year, you can basically choose what you want to do. I wanted to do marine focus, and they didn't at the time, and I don't know if they do now. I don't think so. They didn't offer a marine biology degree. So what
Hmm.
you would do if you wanted to do marine biology is you would do integrative biology. And integrative biology was separate from regular biology in that you could decide what you wanted to focus on. So for me,
Hmm.
it was the marine focus, and that's what I did within there. There was other different people focusing on other stuff. So they had courses. By my fourth year, I could take a scuba diving course, and I was looking for
Hmm.
anything that had marine course in the title. And I remember like
Yeah.
scrolling through and looking, and it said field course in Morea. And I thought, okay, what is that? But it had marine stuff in it. So I looked it up, and it was a course that they teach in French Polynesia. They associate with a station there called the Gump Station. And you
Hmm.
go there for the semester, and you actually get to do your own field work. It's completely marine biology based, your own diving and all that. And I'm like, is this a typo? Like, this is just in amongst all the other courses for Berkeley? And I couldn't believe it. There weren't very many people who had signed up. Like, it was, I felt like I had died and gone to heaven. So privileged that this school has this relationship, that they have this
Yeah.
institute. And so, yeah, I went there for a few months, and that's where you know, I'd sealed the deal. This is what I wanted to commit to for the rest of my academic years. Before that, as I said, it was just taking the tests and doing all those
Yeah.
mandatory courses. But this was where I had the freedom to create my own study from start to end, to execute it, to do all the sampling, and then write it up. So, yeah, that was my experience in integrative biology. Double
That's
thumbs up.
awesome. And then being able to go into a different environment too and explore there.
This is another
Yeah.
thing I think about all the time. Universities are an amazing opportunity to not only go to an institute and get all that incredible knowledge, but also to go abroad. If you have the
Yes.
opportunity to do some of these exchanges, there's a lot of subsidies and ways that can, financially help students do this. It can be very achievable. But for me, for things like marine biology that they didn't necessarily offer it in my institution, I could go elsewhere. So I did a
Yeah.
semester in French Polynesia. I did a semester in Turks and Caicos, which is in the
Hmm.
Caribbean, to do more dive sampling and learn about marine biology in tropical waters. And I mean,
Hmm.
it's like the only time in my life where I'm able to do those things, and there's courses and there's people who can educate you in that area. I mean, it's such a great opportunity. So
Yeah.
I really encourage students who have an idea of what they want to do, or, maybe it's philosophy and they want to go to France, whatever. Like, you can really expand your perspective by going to other places in the field and around the world. So I highly recommend
Yeah.
that as well.
I completely agree. And that's something that I encourage often. I also was able to have an experience like that during my undergrad, where a professor sponsored me to go to Oxford and do chemistry research there. And it was everything, all expenses paid through a granting program. And it was a very simple process. I know some can be a bit more competitive and more work, but I really just needed references from two professors and a one-page application. And then I had the grant to go. So I didn't
Amazing.
get
Amazing.
paid from Oxford, but I got paid through the scholarship. And that was, yeah, exactly, amazing. So I
That
totally
is
agree with
so
you there.
cool. And was that
Yeah.
your own initiative? Did you go to that professor and say, are there any opportunities, or did he approach you?
He sent an email to our research group. So I was volunteering at the time, and that was at Toronto Met. And he told me afterwards that I was the only one in the research lab that even reached out to him to learn more. Not even because, of course, there could be other barriers that you can't end up pursuing it, but I was the only one who even went and had a meeting with him to learn more about it. And then from there, he gave me some options on other professors that I could connect to internationally. And then I just messaged Dr. Anderson in Oxford, and he said, yep, as long as I don't have to pay you and the grant is paying you, then all good, you can come. So it was great.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, good
Yeah.
for you. I mean, sometimes that's all it takes. Like my roommate told me about this opportunity in Turks and Caicos, and it was just a random thing. I'm like, oh, I'll go to the meeting, and same with you, if you hadn't been
Yeah.
open to that,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't even have gone and met that professor. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think what is so cool about the university is oftentimes you will go into a building and there's stuff like old school, like stuck to the wall, like, have
Mm-hmm.
you ever wanted to become a pilot or stuff like that?
Yeah.
The access that you have is really like it's condensed into these short few years when you're trying to decide, what am I going to do with my life? You're still
Mm-hmm.
young. And I really encourage people to just be open, because sometimes
Yeah.
just attending a class that you're like, maybe I'll try this out. It's not connected to what I want to graduate in. But sometimes just going to a new class and hearing something exciting can completely change the course of your life.
Yeah, I agree. And just it gives you more of an understanding of what's out there too. I think that's a great place for me to now transition into your grad school experience. As you were wrapping up with your undergrad, you mentioned that you did your master's in British Columbia and focused on fisheries. So I'm interested in hearing how you ended up choosing both your grad school programs for both your master's and your PhD. And you did two different universities. So what was your thought process there in the research you were seeking out and the universities that you ended up choosing as well?
I think grad school is very different from undergrad. Grad school is when okay, I liked my undergrad experience. But I really want to dive into something more specific. It's much more about you. You're the one who has to do the work. It's very individual, and it's a great time if you know that this is what you're there for. And for me, when I went to UBC, so as I mentioned, I finished at Berkeley the same month I started at UBC, and it was because I had just had this extraordinary experience and I just wanted to keep going. While I was doing my papers for my undergrad, I kept coming across this name, Daniel Pauly. I was continually citing this person, and I thought, who is this guy? So of course I looked him up. Daniel Pauly is a prof at UBC, and he is definitely the number one fishery scientist in the world. But the reason I went to him and started working with him is because all the papers that I read with his work were very different from everything else that I had read. It was a lot about conservation and marine protection. And I'd heard from people who knew him that he was such a progressive thinker and just really outside the box. So I wanted to work with someone like that. So for me, grad school, in both instances, for my master's and my PhD, I chose the person I wanted to work with, not the institution. And
Okay.
I still think that is really good advice. I think for your undergrad, it might be different, but for your graduate school, it's really about your advisor. That's going to be key, the relationship you have with them. Is that what you feel
Yeah.
too? Yeah.
I had a similar, I mean, we've had people on before who have pursued PhDs and they were more focused on the research and the institution as opposed to the person. But for me, from my experience, I wanted to know that I had a supervisor that was going to be supportive. I think it wasn't too much about the research for me, actually. It was more knowing that I'm going to have a supervisor that is going to support me and going to help me throughout my career as well, whether it be similar to that undergrad professor who was so willing to sponsor me to go to Oxford and open doors for us and show us what else is out there.
Hmm.
So I also agree with being able to resonate with your PI, whether it be on the research side or even just values wise too. for your PhD, that was in the UK. And was that also focused on fisheries as well? Did that end up being something that you started to really hone in on through your career?
So I went to UBC first for my master's, and that's where I met Daniel. And he, to this day, remains one of the biggest mentors in my life, just as a person, as a human navigating science and living in this current day and age. I had an incredible experience there. I was looking at the global impact of fishing on the high seas. So the high seas are the areas of ocean that are beyond national jurisdiction, so beyond
Mm-hmm.
200 nautical miles out. They are basically like no man's land. Like nobody really knows what goes on there. Who controls that area? I didn't know, and I was really interested in what happens to all the fish out there because fish don't adhere to any border lines. They're going in and out. They're migrating around, and the health of the ocean really matters to them. I wanted to know if anybody was in charge of that area and those fish. And so I looked into it. Yes, there are organizations who are out there supposed to conserve these fish, but guess what? They're fishing them. They're actually
Yeah.
fishing organizations
Mm-hmm.
first, conservation second or not at all. And so what I discovered was the vast majority of them are overfishing these animals. And the stocks are highly depleted. So I published this work with Daniel, and we were invited to go to the United Nations headquarters in New York City and present our results. So he sent me, and it was an incredible, intimidating experience because, you imagine like, okay, you go to the United Nations and it's just like you imagine. You have people from all over the world walking around in traditional clothing and in suits and ties, and like people are there for a purpose. And I was thinking, oh man, if there were anywhere that I could make a change, it's got to be here in the UN, right? And so I went into this room, and everybody, all the people who sit down have little like plates, and it says your country name, right? So there's like Norway and it was just so cool. But what I didn't know is that everybody in the room, almost everybody in the room, were the heads of those fishing organizations that I was criticizing. So I gave a
Oh.
10-minute talk, and it was like over an hour of just criticisms, relentless, like questioning, like your data's wrong, and I'm like, my data is taken from your websites. Like I'm not trying to, I'm just showing what the science says. But it was really, really an interesting experience because I'd never addressed industry before.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, like they are powerful. And so it was kind of a wake up call. But it was, yeah, so I did that master's that culminated in that presentation, and it was a 3-year program, very, very educational. But at the end of it, I felt pretty overwhelmed and jaded because I had just amassed data from a global perspective on the high seas, crunched the numbers, found out like, oh my God, things are so overfished. And I'm sitting in my office in Vancouver at UBC, like, how can I help this? All I did was write some papers, and what am I doing? I didn't feel a connection to what I was researching. And I think that is something that happens quite frequently now because so much of our work is online. And it's great that we are connecting right now over Zoom, but we're not in person. And a lot of the stuff is very isolating. You're typing it up, you're researching on your own. And I just was like, I know I want to do a PhD, but I don't want to do it in this anymore because I need to be connected. So when I
Mm.
decided to do my PhD, I wanted to return to the ocean and physically connect with the things that I loved, and it had inspired me so much in the beginning. And so I wanted to do field work because that was something that I didn't do for my master's. For my master's, I was just collecting data online, right? And
Okay.
synthesizing.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good to know that there's different types of research too. Yeah. So
Yes,
then for your
exactly.
PhD, it was more hands-on.
It was very hands-on. And you can
Mm.
argue absolutely that the impact of my work for my master's might be far greater because I was looking at the globe, right? And I was taking so much data. For my PhD, I was looking at 15 individual fish in the wild. So that's a tiny
Okay.
sample size, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to physically take the data. I wanted to do observational biology in the field, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing experiments in the lab, because I really do feel like when we're talking about impacts on animals, if you take them out of their environment and then decide to, prod them and research them, you're not going to have a natural behavior, right? So the only way to really determine how they will react naturally is to monitor them in their natural ecosystem. And it is very tricky to monitor a wild fish in the ocean with all the corrosion and the wind and the waves that, all
Yeah.
that goes on with working in the field in marine biology. But anyway, I got strength from interacting with that fish. So my passion since I was 6 and up until the present is always being fish in the sea. And so when I'm diving down and fixing the little camera or getting my hydrophone down and placing it and then running back up and watching it on a video screen, I get pleasure and strength from that. And so for me, it was really important as I'm learning about all the different things that are going wrong in the ocean, how many different ways we're impacting them, that I had the strength to continue. And it was through the everyday work that I was doing with these fish. So I think, again, that's another thing that we can kind of suggest to people as they move on in their careers in academia is when you choose to work in the fields, mostly biology, inherently now when you study biology, you also have to study conservation because it's so different today, right?
Yeah.
And
And it all
you're
goes
good,
hand in hand.
it's all connected. And
Yeah.
so if you're studying biology, you are going to learn about the destruction of our natural ecosystems. And so how can you infuse in your day-to-day work this thread of strength? Where do you find your strength? I think that's really fundamental.
Yeah, that's such great advice too, especially to keep people motivated or to help them find their motivation too and be connected with that. And so maybe I'm skipping a little ahead now, but I would also like to hear how you ended up transitioning more to the science communication side and pursuing media work, coming from the research background that you have, and your purpose and your motivation in that transition as well.
Yeah. So, as in many aspects of life, timing can be such a big part of determining what happens. And for me, when I was finishing my PhD, I'd had a baby, and I I really loved the research. I really loved doing science, but there was an urgency that was getting bigger and bigger in terms of what's happening in the world, specifically in the environmental world. And as I was going on, I felt that I couldn't just continue doing this research. Science takes a long time. It has to, right? You come up with a question, you formulate your hypothesis, you do your experiment, then you do the stats and you write it up, you publish. It takes a long time. It has to because it's thorough. But I felt that we had enough research, we have enough data to show us what we shouldn't be doing anymore. And now is about action. And so as I finished up, I was really starting to lean into media and communications more. So media, I mean, it can be vulgar. There's so many issues with it, of course, but it is quick and it is accessible. So most people in the world today have access to media in some form or another. And you can get a word out immediately. That's so different from science. And so I really wanted to lean into that. And it was just around this time that my dad, David Suzuki, he had been wanting to retire from the nature of things. He's 88 right now.
Mm.
So at that time, he was in his
Yeah.
mid 80s. He's like, I need to retire.
Yeah.
and it was happening, but he hadn't, because he wanted to make sure, he was worried about the show, wanted to make sure it would continue on and all that. And so they were looking for new hosts for the nature of things. And through this long process, they started narrowing down who they would choose as their hosts. But when I was offered the opportunity, it was really this incredible moment. It felt like a marrying of all my passions, which are science, communication, and nature and the environment. So
Mm-hmm.
I I am so grateful for this position, and to be able to talk to people about it. But I really, for me, it was, I'd had that time in science. Now I wanted to do something that was more immediate. And I mean, the other beautiful thing about what I'm doing now is I still get to interact with the science all the time. But it is, as somebody who doesn't know anything, I can go to the people who are at the front lines learning. I was just in Nome, Alaska, talking to scientists about how beavers are expanding northwards because of climate change. So their habitats are changing. And, I can talk to those researchers at the forefront of their
Yeah.
science and learn directly from them what is going on. So I still have that connection with research, but I'm not the one who is actually doing it. So it's
Yeah.
been a neat transformation for me.
I was going to ask you too if you felt like you had to leave any part of your research side behind, but I see so many ways where it can be integrated in these science communication and media opportunities. And I also feel like I relate to some of your experience with research where you felt like you're working so hard, but sometimes you get in your head, or maybe it is the fact of things is that you feel like you're making such a small impact because yeah, you're publishing some papers like how you said, but then you see the bigger picture and there's so much going on, or there's so much more to be discovered. That's how I felt in chemistry. For my master's, I was working on small molecules for pharmaceutical compounds, and
Hmm.
at times I just felt like it's just such a small part of this huge picture, and it was hard to understand, where's my impact in this. And I can see how in some ways there's definitely ways that you can keep pushing those boundaries and growing, but science communication and media really allows you to expand your horizons even more and spread awareness, connect to more people, diversify your own experience too. So I can see how this is such a great opportunity for you at this time to be able to bring in all your passions, as you said.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you raise a really good point. I remember when I was starting in my master's, and this was, I guess, 2006 at UBC, and I was organizing a lecture series where we'd get scientists from all over the world to come and give talks on their work. And I organized for this woman who was she gets scientists to learn how to communicate better. That's her whole job, and she's amazing. And so she'd come up from the States, and I was so excited, and I was rounding everyone up to come listen to her talk. And one of the senior scientists in my lab came up to me, and he put his finger on my face and he said, "I am a scientist. It is not my job to communicate." And I
Mm,
was so taken aback because I'd never, that thought had never crossed my mind before. And so certain people who felt that way didn't come to the lecture. Fast forward to today, almost 20 years later, oh my God. I don't think people feel that way anymore, thank goodness. I definitely think the younger generation understands that that is an outdated model, that it is a huge part of our responsibility
yeah.
to communicate and explain the work that we do. And it is such a breath of fresh air. I think, there are problems with the media, as we've mentioned, but the access, the ability for people to talk about their work in non-academic settings is fantastic. It's really unifying, and it's breaking down those silos that are part of the big problem with academic institutions. So I really
Hmm.
commend you for doing this work.
Thank you. Yeah. And science communication is becoming a big thing now. It's even, people can take it as their undergrad degree, people can take courses in it. There's specific job positions as science communicator in certain companies. So I think it's now bringing in a different lens. And I also wanted to mention how you brought up the nature of things, the docu-series that you're now part of. And I want to just give a shout out because your co-host is Anthony Morgan, who's a TMU. I think he's still doing his PhD. So I'm from TMU. So it's a really cool connection there. And that's actually how I started to interact more with your work, is because I saw him post about it. And so then I started following both of your journeys along there with the nature of things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's shout out Anthony Morgan. He's a fantastic host and human being. So thank you for bringing that
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned too how, your dad led the show for decades. And now that, it's changing hosts and things like that, I wanted to hear too about how you see yourself, and Anthony as well. Maybe you both talked about it together, how you see yourself continuing your father's legacy while also being able to shape your own voice too.
Yeah. So one of the big changes, I would say, besides that there's new faces, is this idea that we're going away. We're less scripted than we used to be. I think there's an idea, because the nature of things has been going on for over 60 years now. It's the longest science show in the world. But when we think of the nature of things traditionally, we tend to think of interviews and kind of like a stationary or static, people talking. What we're trying to do in this next iteration is make it a little bit more, less staged, less scripted, more authentic, less rehearsed, more real. And I think that authenticity is something that people are really wanting and connecting to. And we know that through social media. And so what Anthony and I are trying to do is guide the conversations by our own questions that just naturally emerge. And also, when we're figuring out which shows we're going to do, making sure that there is kind of that natural organic thread of curiosity, like, oh, yeah, bats, I've always wondered when I was a kid, like some kind of connection to have it, make more personal, and to give it a reason that we're embarking on this journey. So, it's going to be a little bit more authentic, raw, that type of thing. But I want to reiterate the fundamental pillars of the nature of things, which in my mind are environment, science, social causes, the long form format, being able to dive in for almost an entire hour and really get into the nitty gritty. Those things are not going to change. And I think that we have an amazing audience. Some people have grown up on the nature of things, and I
Yeah.
want to make sure that that legacy, that those combinations of what make it so powerful will remain.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can't wait to see how it grows even more. This is a great place for me to ask my last question for you before bringing in Gabby. The question I have that I want to end off with you on is, what are your hopes for your future career development and what do you hope to achieve?
Ooh, great question. I mean, I hope that am privileged enough to stay with the nature of things for a long time. I think what the nature of things has built up is so important. I really want to try and make sure that we keep our eyes on impact filmmaking as well, to make sure that it's not just about the film and then we're moving on, but the things that we cover, the people we meet, there's a relationship there, and that we continue to advocate for whatever causes we are talking about in the show. I'm always trying to make filming more sustainable. I'm really trying to cut back on travel. Now we have so many tools with Zoom and other things. There are no more excuses. And I really am trying to make an impact on the film industry in my own small way as much as I can, and try to
Yeah.
increase that influence. And then, on a personal level, I'm just trying to be the person that I say I am to my children, and just always connect them to nature as I was connected as a child with my parents. When COVID hit and we had to fill our days, rain or shine, we would go out and try to discover another little ecosystem or interact with the spiders on our porch or something like that. And we rediscovered swamps. And I am so obsessed with swamps now because of my kids and because of the joy
Mm.
and the awe and the curiosity that they've gotten through dip netting through these swamps. And I want to do a show on them. I want to dive deeper. But for me, connection, I think I've mentioned this theme a few times. Connection is so important with each other, with nature, with our communities, with what we eat, our relationship, all of it. It's about connection. And we've lost a lot of that over the last few years for different reasons. But I think anytime we're able to connect is when we feel more powerful.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sarika, for answering my questions. I'll bring in Gabby now, and she'll ask you her question from a student perspective.
Okay, great.
Nice to see you. I'm honored to meet you. I'm Gabby. I go to Dalhousie University. I'm in my first year.
Great.
I didn't mention that Gabby is also my former student too, so that's the connection there.
She got me through high school. I owe her.
No way! Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and we got to build a really good relationship all through my 11th and 12th year, which was great.
Talk about mentorship. Oh, I love that.
Thanks, Gabby. Well, why don't you ask Sarika your main question, and then we'll end there.
So as a student looking to do stuff similar to you, I was wondering if there were specific challenges that you faced through the earlier parts of your career, and if you think that those were challenges that other professionals in the same spot faced as well, or if they were kind of isolated to your experience.
Challenges. Yeah. I mean, I remember really early on somebody saying to me, multiple people saying to me, adults, marine biology, why would you ever want to do that? You're never going to get a job in that field. Go into dentistry or become a doctor. Like it was very strong advice. If you want to make money, don't go into marine biology. For me, it was not, I wasn't going into marine biology for the money. I really believe that if you follow your passion, things will likely fall into place. And I know that comes from a very privileged situation, but I would never have imagined that this is what I would be doing, just as I'm sure Julia didn't imagine that this is what she was doing when she started in chemistry. I think that when you're passionate about something, that will pull you through. I don't think people who are doing research and feeling really dejected and overwhelmed and stressed out and they don't have the energy to do it. They're not doing their best work. When you're doing your best work is when you're passionate about it and you want to be there and you're waking up early because you can't wait to start your day. And so I think, especially in university, when you have often that ability to take courses and to have the freedom to kind of explore what you want to do in life, is maybe later in life when you have a family and a mortgage and all that, it might be more, will be more difficult. I really encourage you to follow what you're passionate about, even if it seems ridiculous to you in the moment. Just try it out. I think you owe it to yourself. I think about my dad. His parents were like, you have to be a doctor. That was what he was going to do. And then one day he had to take a course in genetics and it blew his mind. He fell in love that day and he couldn't look away. And he became an incredible geneticist. And then because he was so passionate about it and such a good orator, then somebody said, hey, would you do this radio show for us? And then things just kind of happen. And it all comes from that passion, that burning desire. So I'm super curious about what you're interested in. I'm so sorry I have to go, but before I go, I would love to hear what ignites you.
I'm really interested in conservation, like sea turtles and their reefs and their ecosystems. That's what I hope to do. And that's why I wanted to know what you think, because that's kind of similar situation. I know I'm much earlier on still, but already everyone around me is like, what are you going to do with marine biology? And I'm trying to take those courses and do those experiences and get all of that in, because I know that like that's what's going to fuel me to get through all of it and go for what I want to do.
Good for you. I love that you already have a dream and things that excite you. A lot of people don't have that. It's a little bit harder for them. The David Suzuki Foundation is doing amazing work as well. There's so many others, and specifically for sea turtles. Oh man, there's a lot of great people out there. So thank you for the work you do. I hope that you don't leave it. And Julia, I just want to say your professionalism and your questions and your deep research into the people that you're interviewing goes such a long way, and it is so appreciated. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I connected with Susan probably a year ago, so this was a long time coming, and She was so great to work with to help coordinate. So I'm so happy that we were able to have you on and also bring Gabby. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, great. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Thanks,
day.
Sarika. Thank you so much to Sarika for coming on the Mentorship podcast. This was such an inspiring conversation about pursuing a career in marine biology, the importance of science communication, and the impact of following your passions. Her advice was truly motivating, and we're so excited to have featured our first student segment as part of this episode to bring in a new perspective. As we wrap up our 5th season, we'd love to hear from you. Our anonymous feedback form is linked in the episode description. It only takes a few minutes, and we would love to hear your thoughts or future guest suggestions. This season has been incredible, and we're so grateful for your support. We'll be back in the new year with more insights, inspiration, and mentorship to guide your career journey. Until then, be sure to follow us on @MentProjects on all social media platforms for updates and more mentorship resources. Thank you so much for listening.